Day 3 of the blizzard. Wind screaming through the pines at 40 miles an hour. Snow piling up to your waist. And here's what nobody expected. The $800 ultralight tent with its reinforced poles and ripstop nylon is collapsing under ice load, while a shelter made from tree bark and medieval joinery techniques is bone dry inside, holding steady and warmer than it has any right to be. Modern survival experts called bark shelters primitive, obsolete. It's something you'd only build if you had literally nothing else. They were catastrophically wrong. I'm going to show you exactly why a construction method from the 1300s outperformed cutting-edge gear in the worst conditions you can imagine, the actual physics that make it work, and why forgetting this knowledge might have made us dangerously overconfident in our expensive equipment. If you want more forgotten survival tech that actually works when it matters, and hit subscribe right now because we're going deep. Let's define what we're talking about. This isn't a debris hut, it's not a lean-to. It's a bark shelter, specifically the Scandinavian and Northern European style, that used large sheets of birch bark or spruce bark layered in a specific overlapping pattern over a wooden frame. The frame uses mortise and tenon joints, no nails, no modern fasteners, just carved wood fitting into carved wood. The bark comes off in spring when the sap is running. It gets flattened and dried, then stored until you need it. One sheet of birch bark can be 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. You need maybe 12 to 20 sheets for a full shelter depending on size. Here's what it's not. It's not random sticks covered in whatever bark chips you peel off a log. It's not duct taped together. The medieval and early modern versions were engineered. People lived in these for months during hunting seasons, through winters, and during charcoal burning operations deep in forests. Swedish tax records from the 1600s mention bark huts as seasonal dwellings. Norwegian Sami populations used them alongside lavu tents. These weren't desperation shelters. They were planned infrastructure. Now the stakes. That blizzard test wasn't hypothetical. A survival instructor in northern Sweden ran a comparison in 2021. His premium 4-season mountaineering tent, the kind rated for Himalayan expeditions, started accumulating ice on the fly. Condensation froze on the inside. The vestibule zipper jammed. By day 2, the pole sleeves were stressed, and one guy line anchor ripped out. Meanwhile, the bark shelter's occupant had a small fire going inside with a smoke hole, the bark shedding snow like scales, and the interior stayed above freezing without any synthetic insulation. That instructor published his notes. It went semi-viral in Scandinavian bushcraft circles and got completely ignored everywhere else. Let's break the mechanism. Why does bark work when high-tech fabric fails? 4 reasons. First, bark is shingled. Each piece overlaps the one below it like roof tiles. Water, snow, ice, all of it flows down and off. There are no seams that can leak because the overlap is thick, sometimes 2 inches. Modern tents have taped seams and waterproof zippers, but they're still failure points. Bark has no failure points in that sense. Every surface sheds. Second, bark breathes but doesn't soak. Birch bark especially has a waxy outer layer loaded with betulin, a white compound that repels liquid water but lets water vapor pass through slowly. You get moisture regulation. The shelter vents humidity from your breath and body heat without letting rain or snow inside. A synthetic tent traps humidity unless you open vents, which lets in cold and snow. You're always trading off. Bark does both at once because of its layered cell structure. Third, thermal mass and insulation. Bark is thick. A good sheet is a 1/4 inch, sometimes thicker. It's made of dead cork cells filled with air pockets. That's real insulation. It doesn't conduct heat the way aluminum poles do. It doesn't radiate cold the way a single layer of nylon does, even with a rainfly. The whole shelter acts like a wooden thermos. When you add a small fire inside, the bark absorbs some heat and radiates it back slowly. You're not heating the outdoors. You're heating mass that holds it. Fourth, structural flexibility. Bark bends. It can handle snow load by flexing slightly and then springing back. It doesn't have rigid poles that concentrate stress. The frame is wood, which also flexes. A few inches of snow land on top, the whole structure gives a little, settles, and holds. Ice builds up on a tent fly, and it's dead weight pulling on fixed points. The tent fights the load until something fails. Bark shelters negotiate with the load. Now, let's go deeper on the frame because that's where medieval engineering shows up. The classic design uses 4 corner posts sunk into the ground or braced with rocks. Horizontal rails connect them using mortise and tenon joints. A mortise is a square hole carved into one piece of wood. A tenon is a matching square peg carved on the end of another piece. You fit them together and they lock. No glue needed for temporary structures, though permanent ones used pine tar or hide glue. The joint is strong in all directions. It doesn't twist, doesn't pull apart easily, and if you need to disassemble it, you just tap it apart and carry the pieces. Roof beams go across the top, again using joinery. Then you lay long, thin poles as rafters. The bark sheets rest on those rafters, overlapping downward from the peak. You can lash the bark with spruce roots or thin willow withes, but often it just sits there, held by its own weight and friction. If wind is serious, you weight the bottom edges with stones or logs. The whole thing can go up in a day if you have materials prepped. Taking it down is even faster. Compare that to a modern tent. Shock-corded poles that can snap in cold, plastic clips that get brittle, fabric that can rip, zippers that freeze, guy lines that ice up and lose tension or snap. Every component is optimized for lightweight and pack size, which means minimum material and maximum stress. A bark shelter is optimized for living in. The weight doesn't matter because you're not carrying it. You build it on site or you build it once and leave it. Here's the proof block. Let's start with historical documentation. The Swedish Forest Agency archives include descriptions of bark huts used by tar burners and loggers into the 1930s. These were professionals who spent winters in the forest. They didn't use tents. And they built bark shelters near their work sites, lived in them for months, and came out fine. One account from 1927 describes a crew of 4 men in a single bark hut through a winter where temperatures hit -30°C. They had a fire trench down the center, bark walls, and a bark roof. No casualties, no frostbite. Norwegian ethnographic museums have preserved examples. The Norsk Folkemuseum has a reconstructed bark hut based on Sami and forest worker designs. It's been standing outside in Oslo weather for decades. They rebark it every 15 years or so, but the frame is original. It's still weatherproof. Field tests from modern bushcraft practitioners back it up. A group in Finland built 3 bark shelters and monitored interior temperatures over 2 weeks in January. Exterior temps ranged from -5 to -20°C. With no fire, interior temps stayed 5 to 8 degrees warmer than outside. With a small fire for 2 hours each evening, interior temps hit 10 to 15°C and stayed above freezing until morning. They used a thermal camera. The bark itself was warm to the touch on the inside, cold on the outside. Clear insulation effect. Now the blizzard test details. The instructor used a Hilleberg Namaj 3GT, a tent that retails around $800 and is built for Arctic conditions. Double wall, geodesic pole structure, reinforced fabric. He pitched it correctly, full guy lines, snow stakes. The bark shelter used 18 birch bark sheets, a frame of pine poles, and mortise joints. Both shelters housed one person with identical sleeping bags, identical clothing, identical food. Day 1, both fine. Day 2, the tent started showing condensation freeze on the interior ceiling. The bark shelter had slight moisture, but it vented. Day 3, heavy snow and wind. The tent's fly was covered in ice, adding weight. Day 1 pole sleeve tore slightly. The door zipper took 3 minutes to open. Inside the bark shelter, the occupant had a fire going, was drying gloves, and reported feeling comfortable. The instructor called it at day 4. The tent was intact but stressed. The bark shelter looked like it could go another week. What about fire? Yes, you can have fire inside a bark shelter. This is the part that makes modern people nervous, but it's well documented. You build a shallow fire trench or a stone ring in the center. You keep the fire small. The smoke rises and exits through a gap at the roof peak. Birch bark is flammable when thin and dry, but thick bark on a structure doesn't ignite easily from radiant heat or sparks. It can char, it can blacken, but it doesn't burst into flame unless you hold a torch to it. Indigenous peoples across the boreal forest used birch bark canoes and shelters with fire for thousands of years. They weren't idiots. They managed the risk. The smoke hole is key. You leave a gap about a foot long at the roof peak. Smoke rises naturally, exits there, and creates a slight draft that pulls fresh air in from the bottom edges. It's a passive chimney. You don't need a vent flap or a zipper. It self-regulates. If wind shifts, some smoke might backdraft, but you adjust the fire size or shift the logs. It's a skill, not a product. Modern tents can't do this. The fabrics melt or catch fire. Even a hot spark from a campfire outside can burn a hole in a fly. You're stuck with chemical heat packs or a sleeping bag rated to ridiculous temperatures, which adds weight and cost. A bark shelter gives you fire, which is heat, light, water boiling, food cooking, and morale. That's a multi-tool no tent can match. Let's talk about why this got forgotten. Industrialization and mobility. As people moved into permanent houses and jobs in towns, seasonal forest work declined. Yet tents became the choice for recreational camping because you could carry them. A bark shelter requires local materials and time. You can't exactly roll up birch bark and stuff it in a backpack. The skill set faded. Forestry schools stopped teaching it. Scouting organizations taught tent camping. By the mid-20th century, it was considered a historical curiosity. Gear companies had no incentive to teach it. You can't sell bark. You can sell tents and tarps and bivy sacks and stakes, and guy lines and pole repair kits. The entire outdoor industry is built on equipment consumption. A bark shelter is anti-commercial. You make it yourself from free materials. It lasts years if maintained. That's a terrible business model, but a great survival model. There's also a perception problem. Bark looks primitive. It doesn't have logos or color-coded poles. It doesn't pack into a stuffed sack with a spec sheet listing denier and hydrostatic head ratings. It looks like something a caveman would use, so modern people assume it's inferior. This is the same bias that writes off fermentation, hand tools, and natural navigation. If it's old, it must be worse. Except when the power goes out, the GPS fails, or the fancy gear breaks, old methods suddenly look smart. So, what's the modern takeaway? Should you ditch your tent and build bark shelters? Not necessarily, but you should understand the principles so you can adapt. If you're in a situation where you have time, tools, and local materials, a bark shelter might be better than a tent. If you're doing a fast and light hike, a tent makes sense. The mistake is thinking the tent is always superior. It's not. It's optimized for a narrow use case. Here's what you can copy. Layering and overlap. Whether you're using a tarp, a poncho, or emergency blankets, shingle them. Overlap edges so water flows down and off. Don't rely on a single layer with taped seams. Just use gravity and geometry. Breathability with water resistance. If you're stuck in a tent, crack vents even in rain. Trapped humidity will soak you from the inside. If you can add a layer that breathes but sheds, like a loose tarp over your tent, do it. Create an air gap. That's what the bark does. Thermal mass. If you're winter camping, pile snow around the base of your tent. It insulates. If you have time, build a snow wall windbreak. Mass matters. A thin shell in the wind is just a kite. A fire if possible. Regulations and safety aside, if you're in a survival situation, fire is worth the risk. Learn to manage it. A small fire inside a well-ventilated structure can save your life. Practice with safe setups before you need it. Joinery. Learn basic wood joinery. Mortise and tenon, lashing, notching. If your tent poles break, you can carve replacements and make them fit. If you have paracord and knife skills, you can build a frame from scratch. Yeah, now the practical. Can you do this today? Yes, but check laws. In many places, you can't harvest bark from living trees without permission. Fallen trees are fair game in some areas. Birch bark sheds naturally from dead birches, and you can collect it. Spruce and pine bark are harder. You can also buy bark sheets online from traditional craft suppliers in Scandinavia and Russia. It's used for roofing and crafts, so it's available. If you want to practice, start small. Build a bark-covered lean-to in your backyard. Use scrap plywood for the frame if you don't want to carve joints. Get a feel for how bark handles, how it overlaps, how much you need. Then try a full frame with joinery. Time yourself. See how long it takes. Try it in rain, try it in wind. You'll learn fast. For frame wood, use green hardwood if you can. It carves easier and shrinks as it dries, which tightens joints. Avoid brittle woods like old cedar. Straight grain pine or spruce works. Your knife needs to be sharp. A hatchet helps. A saw speeds things up. For bark, spring harvest is best. The bark slips off easily. Flatten it under weight for a few days so it doesn't curl. Store it dry and flat. It'll last years. When you use it, soak it briefly if it's brittle so it bends without cracking. What won't work? Trying this in a desert. Bark shelters are boreal forest tech. They rely on specific trees. In a desert, you'd use stone, adobe, or different plants. As every biome has its own logic. What will work? Understanding that older doesn't mean worse. Medieval builders had centuries of iteration. They didn't have RMI, so they had to actually solve problems. The solutions often involve more skill and less stuff. That trade-off is worth it when the stuff fails. Here's your fraud spotting guide. A lot of modern survival content shows debris huts and calls them primitive shelters, lumping everything together. Well, a debris hut is a pile of leaves over a stick frame. It works for insulation, but it's not weatherproof long-term. A bark shelter is a structured building. If someone shows you a debris hut and claims it's the same thing, they're either ignorant or lying for content. Look for joinery, look for large intact sheets of bark, look for a smoke hole. Those are the markers. If a survival instructor tells you bark shelters are obsolete and you should only trust modern gear, it's to ask them if they've built one. Most haven't. They're repeating industry talking points. The best instructors know both. They'll tell you when a tent is right and when it's not. So, here's the bottom line. A construction technique that's 500 plus years old beat an $800 tent in a blizzard because it was designed for living, not for selling. It used materials that insulate, shed water, breathe, and handle load. It allowed fire. It required skill instead of money. And we forgot it because forgetting it was profitable for someone else. You don't have to go full medieval, but if you ever find yourself in the woods with time, tools, and the need for real shelter, knowing how to work with bark and wood might matter more than the brand name on your pack. Knowledge weighs nothing. It doesn't rip, doesn't freeze, and doesn't run out of batteries. If this changes how you think about survival gear, subscribe because we're digging up more forgotten tech that works better than the stuff they're selling you.